20 shell organizations leading to the Biden family, 12 different banks, and $10 million coming from our foreign adversaries that was funneled all the way down to Biden family members. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovich. And we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody, welcome to Freedom Friday. So we all know that our freedoms are being slowly eroded by the Biden administration, actually quickly, not slowly, but it seems that they are taking censorship to a whole new level. And last week, the White House press office announced that they were putting new restrictions on press badges and creating new rules for reporters in order to gain access to White House press briefings. So we already know that pretty much every question that the White House will even answer is pre-selected and pre-approved before any press briefing. So it's already just rehearsed and fake to begin with. Every time there is a press conference, Biden answers, if you want to call it answering, predetermined questions, and KJP never answers anything at all. So there was an incident a couple weeks ago when Biden announced his bid for re-election. And during that press conference, he was holding a piece of paper with an LA Times reporter's name and a list of questions on it. And then, of course, she ended up being the first person he called on. And when he did call on her, she asked the same question that was on the paper. So it's very obvious that he's given questions beforehand so that he can't be caught off guard with having to respond to something that his handlers haven't prepared him to answer ahead of time. But now the Biden administration has changed the rules for who can even be present at a White House press conference. They apparently sent an email out to reporters announcing that all current press hard passes will expire on January 31st, which is basically their press credentials. Wow, I can't speak today.
July 31st, right?
Yeah, what did I say?
January.
Jeez, yeah, wow, okay. July 31st. And in order to request renewal, that reporter's bureau chief or supervisor needs to email an official letter to the White House press office confirming that the reporter is a full-time employee and that their principal job is the news. And then they must also have a confirmed address in Washington, D.C. And they also must be able to prove that the reporter has been at a White House press conference at least once during the past 6 months, or that the reporter has proof of employment within the last 3 months to cover the White House, or that their assignment is covering the White House on a regular basis. And on top of that, any reporter applying for a credential must also be accredited by the U.S. Supreme Court or by Congress, and they must be willing to submit to, quote, any necessary investigation by the U.S. Secret Service to determine eligibility for access to the White House complex, where Secret Service will determine eligibility based on whether the applicant presents a potential risk to the safety or security of the president, the vice president, or the White House complex. Also included in this email was a paragraph about how reporters are expected to behave. And I'm going to read that direct quote, which is, the White House expects that all hard pass holders will act in a professional manner while on White House grounds by respecting their colleagues, White House employees, and guests, observing stated restrictions on access to areas of the White House or credentialed events, and not impeding events or briefings on campus. Absent security concerns involving the U.S. Secret Service or other exigent circumstances, the White House will provide a written warning to you if your conduct violates these expectations. Subsequent violations may lead to suspension or revocation of your hard pass. So, Stephanie, here's my question. What constitutes acting in a professional manner or impeding events or briefings? Like, these are very vague rules. And I'm going to guess that this will all be very subjective and at the whim of the White House. And it's clearly directed at like conservative news outlets or anyone who's challenging the narrative. So basically, if a reporter asks a question and the Biden administration doesn't like the question, this new rule basically gives them the power to easily ban that person from the White House.
Exactly. I think they kept it vague on purpose, obviously, so they can kick out any reporter that goes against the narrative. And just by doing this, they're letting the reporters know that they better not ask about the corrupt Biden family business transactions that are coming to light. And I bet any money in the next press conference, you won't see any questions from reporters about these new revelations, knowing that they're not going to be invited back to the White House if they ask about it.
Exactly. And this is like a huge control move by the Biden administration. And it's coming at a time when Biden is already facing criticism for the fact that he hardly ever holds press briefings in the first place. There was an article in the Washington Free Beacon on Wednesday talking about how the Washington Post editorial board called Biden's rare press availability, quote, not acceptable, and stating that, quote, as he runs for a second term, he should be eager to show he can handle all aspects of the job. Pick up the microphone, Mr. President. The media is not your enemy. And the Washington Post also wrote, quote, it shouldn't take a visit from a foreign leader for the president to take questions, which was referring to the fact that Biden already has this like record low number of press conferences. And so far this year, I guess he's only held 2 joint sessions with world leaders, and he hasn't done any solo press conferences at all. And these comments from the Washington Post are on the heels of the White House barring the New York Post from an airline policy press event with Biden and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg this past Monday. And the reporter for the New York Post, Stephen Nelson, he was told, quote, we are unable to accommodate your credential request to attend the Investing in Airline Accountability remarks on May 8th. The remarks will be live streamed and can be viewed at wh.gov. Thank you for understanding. We will let you know if a credential becomes available. And then there were photos from the press conference that surfaced, and they showed that there were like 20 empty media seats, which seems to clearly undermine this explanation from the White House press office for deciding to block the New York Post from attending. And Nelson believes that the Biden administration is setting what he calls a, quote, anti-press freedom precedent by pre-screening journalists. And honestly, I totally agree with that. And the Washington Free Beacon also put out an article on May 8th suggesting that the banning of the New York Post on Monday was basically a sign that the president's team is increasingly sensitive to the coverage of Hunter Biden, like you said, Stephanie, and that this could be cracking down on media access after the launch of his reelection campaign, because the Post was apparently the first media outlet to even reveal the existence of Hunter Biden's laptop in October of 2020. And then apparently back in February, Biden blew up at another New York Post reporter when he asked a question about the Biden family's financial dealings with China. And Biden's response was to totally evade the question and then say, like, give me a break, man. You can come to my office and ask a question when you have more polite people with you. So, Stephanie, like, obviously, this ban is because of what's happening with all the Biden crime family ties coming to light, don't you think?
Come on, man.
Yeah.
I freaking hate when he says that. But yeah, of course it is. Shit's hitting the fan and they're in damage control mode, trying to keep this from hurting the next election. And guess what? It's working, because almost every mainstream media outlet is completely burying the story. And instead, they're focusing on like nonsense with Trump. No surprise there. But Tara, I want to just put this into context so everyone fully understands the 2-tiered government that we have. So Trump, along with all of his children and their businesses, were investigated by every single agency for about 4 years, and they found nothing, not so much as a freaking parking ticket. Now you have Joe Biden and his family with 170 now. Now we know there's 170 suspicious activity reports from banks flagging transactions that look suspicious. And on Wednesday, the House Oversight Committee held a press conference with some interesting new information they found while combing through those suspicious activity reports. And if our listeners haven't seen it, it's because the mainstream media refuses to freaking cover it. So what they found just so far is that there are over 20 shell organizations leading to the Biden family. 12 different banks and $10 million coming from our foreign adversaries that was funneled all the way down to Biden family members. And that's only from looking at 4 out of the 12 banks so far. So just imagine how much more is going to come to light. They still have 8 banks to go. And what's crazier is that these were all from countries where Joe Biden was in charge of policy as the vice president at the time. And according to the House Oversight Chair, James Comer, China was actually the most reputable one. They were involved with countries like Romania that are known for corruption. And I'm going to play a clip from that press conference where Byron Donalds from Florida explains one of the shocking findings.
American people definitely know is that the Biden family doesn't really have a business. There is no business structure around this family except politics. And since Joe Biden has spent decades in the Senate, served 8 years as vice president, and is now president of the United States, and the family's getting money from various countries and foreign businesses through various shell companies and this web of LLCs. I mean, guys, you in the press, this is easy pickings. I'm giving you Pulitzer stuff here. Like, all you have to do is literally look at our memo and see the level of detail upon which they have created this. And it's very, very frustrating. We have now been able to clearly see that the Biden's associates, like Rob Walker, Eric Sherman, has been discussed, created at least 16 companies while Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. 16 companies created while he was vice president. Now the list is 20. And as we continue our investigation, that list is growing. And like I said before, the question is to serve what purpose? And the purpose of all these companies being created is to conceal money that the Biden family has been gaining because Joe Biden has been sitting at the upper echelon of our politics for almost 5 decades. That is the entire purpose here. Here's an example of what I mean. You have Rosemont Seneca Partners, Rosemont Seneca Advisors, Rosemont Seneca Technology Partners, RSP Holdings, RSTP2 Alpha, RSTP2 Bravo, Rosemont Seneca Thornton, Rosemont Seneca Bohai. I want to make sure I pronounce it right. Bohai, B-O-H.
Okay, we get the point, right? Like, I wanted to play that because it's just so absurd. How many Rosemont Seneca LLCs does one need? I mean, it's so corrupt. And this is while Joe Biden was the vice president of our country, where his family created 16 LLCs, where money was funneled from foreign adversaries, passing through these LLCs, ending up in bank accounts of 9 Biden family members. I mean, I don't know why this is not front page news of every single news organization out there. And these are records from various banks, like reports were filed. This is not hearsay. This is actual evidence from banks. Our Department of Treasury had all of these documents and knew about this all along since he was vice president. And like Byron Donalds pointed out, what was the business of those 16 LLCs? No one knows. No one will say, because it appears to be a shell organization used to take money in exchange for our American vice president and his policies that are now ruining the country. And there was so much moving around of this money that it's clear they were purposely making it nearly impossible to track. I mean, there's no reason that anyone or any business would have to move money around to that extent. And here's the thing, too. All Biden has to do is come forward and say exactly what the 20 plus companies were for. What were they selling? What's their product? What's their legitimate service that they're offering? But there is none, right? Like, how were his nieces and nephews and grandchildren getting money from these companies? What was their role in the company? That would sure clear things up if he came forward and just told everybody. But of course, that won't happen because we all know that this is pure corruption. And now Biden is going to go hide in his basement, and the media, along with the FBI and DOJ, are going to make sure that nothing ever happens to him and that the narrative is spun back around on Trump or someone else. And House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer issued a legally binding subpoena last week, which requires the FBI to turn over the file that they're requesting by noon Wednesday. But guess what? The Bureau instead replied with a 6-page letter raising various objections. Quote, information from confidential human sources is unverified and by definition incomplete. wrote FBI Acting Assistant Director for Congressional Affairs Christopher Dunham. He also argued that informant reports must be kept private to protect sources, saying, quote, as is clear from the name itself, confidentiality is definitional to the FBI's Confidential Human Source Program. Confidential human sources often provide information to the FBI at great risks to themselves and their loved ones. The information they provide can also create significant risks to others who may be referenced in their reporting. Okay, seriously, like we're never gonna see this document. And I want to point out a clip that is from our wonderful FBI director, Christopher Wray, and what he said in a congressional hearing following all of this.
And Chairman Comer subpoenaed an FBI document containing an allegation regarding a pay-to-play scheme between then Vice President Biden and a foreign national. And your response was due just a little bit earlier today. So my question is, has the FBI complied with the subpoena for this document?
I believe we submitted a lengthy letter earlier today.
The letter, not the document that was the subject of the subpoena request.
I can't speak to the specific document. We are committed to working collaboratively with both committees, but we also have to balance sources and methods and ongoing investigations. And we will continue to work through the accommodation process as has happened many times in the past.
Was there a plan to submit the document, or will it be never submitted, or has there been a conclusion?
I would refer to the letter, which is, I think, quite detailed and kind of goes through a fair amount of discussion about our proposed approach
to addressing the document. I do want to confirm, though, the document does exist, the FD 1023.
I really can't get into the specifics.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, just keep squirming, Christopher Wray, because the Biden administration never feels like they have to answer to anyone for anything. It is absolutely ridiculous, and we should not be just sitting back and allowing this to happen. So just to give a little more insight on how fucked up this is, how corrupt this family is, foreign operatives would pay money to Hunter Biden's associate called Rob Walker. And then a third would be dispersed to Biden. 16 of the 17 payments from Romanian businessman Gabriel Popovich occurred while Joe Biden was vice president. And at that same time, Joe Biden spoke in Romania about corruption. Like, the balls on this guy. So I heard a clip from this that the Morning Wire pulled. So let's just go ahead and play that because it's really funny.
During this time, then Vice President Biden was lecturing Romania about the dangers of foreign influence in politics. Here's Biden speaking in Romania in May of 2014.
When politicians can be bought, when courts can be manipulated, when the media becomes a tool of propaganda, there you will find a society that is susceptible to manipulation from the outside.
Well, no shit. He's right, but he's talking about himself.
Yeah, he's so fucking corrupt.
The arrogance and the balls of this guy, like, unfucking believable. But the business deals aren't the only thing that Congress has uncovered. There's also evidence that Hunter Biden was paying tens of thousands of dollars to prostitutes that came from international sex trafficking rings. And during that time, Joe Biden allegedly paid his son while he was turning around and spending that money on human trafficked prostitutes. Like this, it just gets very dark with this family and what they're involved in. And again, I would just like to point out the deep state media widely covering the Stormy Daniels claim against Donald Trump, yet here's actual evidence that the Bidens were paying for sex trafficked victims, and the media is totally ignoring it. And like last week, when we covered the 85,000 missing children who were human trafficked and how the Biden administration is the middleman, yet the media isn't all over the story. Like, clearly, they're protecting the Bidens. And if this were Trump, like, it would be all over every news outlet 24/7. And Tara, you know how liberals like to call anyone that disagrees with them a racist? I think maybe we should start calling them pedophiles and human traffickers because it seems like they pretty much are going along with that agenda. And there's so much evidence piling up. And what worries me is now when Congress wants answers from anyone in the government, they can simply say that they can't comment because it's an ongoing investigation. So all Congress really has is subpoena power. And if the FBI isn't going to cooperate, then once again, this isn't going to go anywhere. And we all know we can't depend on the Department of Justice to actually deliver justice. So this administration has made it crystal clear that there actually is a deep state and two tiers of justice in this country. And like we always say, conspiracy theories are simply facts that are verified in 6 months. And the deep state conspiracy theory is being proved right now as we speak.
Yeah. And this whole thing with like censoring media, like we've obviously experienced this in terms of social media and things being censored that don't go along with the narrative. But this new, like, these new rules and regulations, you guys need to understand like the seriousness of this whole thing. And like one of the other things that Steve Nelson pointed out, that New York Post reporter, was last July, KJP basically promised to end COVID era screening process, the things that were giving the press office control over which reporters were allowed to attend presidential remarks. And many reporters have accused the White House of selectively enforcing this policy, which if you listen to any mainstream media, that seems fairly obvious. There was another reporter named Simon Atiba. I guess he works for Today News Africa. He's all over Twitter. And he like posted all this shit about how he thinks this policy is directed at him because I guess he's one of the reporters who's always challenging KJP. He's in the back shouting out questions. And he told Fox Digital News that he thinks this new press rule is designed to, quote, kick out unfriendly and tough reporters. This rule will be used against people like me who have been trying to ask hard questions. It's simply a threat against the First Amendment. And that's exactly what's happening right now, is all of this is a threat against the First Amendment.
Yeah. And once again, they're setting a precedent that's dangerous. Like, could you imagine if Trump did that? The backlash, they would say, oh, he's racist. He's not allowing the African reporter to speak. Like, this is something that happens in a dictatorship where state propaganda is the only thing allowed. And here we live in a democracy where people get to vote. Therefore, we need transparency. We need to hear from our president and the administration. And they just haven't done that from day one. And now they're, prepping the basement for Biden again. And anyone that objects is going to be silenced. And, it's anti-American and it goes against everything that we stand for as a free country. And everyone needs to start speaking up while we still have the opportunity to.
Yeah. And meanwhile, you have Trump speaking out and he's meeting with like left-leaning news outlets. He's not afraid to say anything. He's not afraid to talk to anyone. And that's exactly what a leader should be doing. And Stephanie, I don't know if you saw the CNN town hall he did on Wednesday in New Hampshire, but the moderator, Caitlin Collins, she was trying to get him to admit that he lost the 2020 election and get him to like disavow his claims that it was stolen or rigged. And she kept trying to interrupt him. And I fucking love this because he told her that, quote, only a very stupid person would fail to see the problems with the 2020 election. And then he said he knows she isn't stupid, but perhaps she was given an agenda. And then he said, quote, our country is dying. Our country is being destroyed by stupid people. And he's totally right. Like he got hit with a ton of questions. He talked about securing the border, which, by the way, I know we're going to have another episode on that soon because the floodgates opened yesterday with the expiration of Title 42. And I guarantee you it's a fucking shit show, phenomenal proportions at the border right now. Trump talked about lowering energy costs and improving our economy and, going back to drilling for oil. I think he said, like, we're going to drill, baby, drill. And he said the Biden administration is basically spending money like drunken sailors, and Republicans should refuse to raise the debt limit and continue to call for spending cuts, and that defaulting on our debts would be preferable to allowing the federal government to keep spending money we don't have, which, by the way, I know I'm going off on a tangent, but this just came out yesterday, so I'm going to throw this in there. Biden wants to invoke the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling himself, so we don't default on our debts, but it's unclear if he really has the authority to do that. And apparently deciding whether or not to do so could involve litigation that could end up being tied in court for some unknown amount of time during which the government might default anyway. But one of the clauses in the 14th Amendment states, quote, the validity of the public debt of the U.S. authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. So the Biden administration is arguing that defaulting on our debts is unconstitutional. So Biden would have a duty to nullify the debt limit if Congress won't raise it. And I read an article in The Independent, and it was talking about how the U.S. Treasury Department is saying we may not be able to even borrow the money that we need to repay our bills and bondholders, and that this could occur as soon as June 1st if there's no congressional action, which could launch us into clearly a very bad recession. And on Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen basically said that invoking the Fourth Amendment could provoke a constitutional crisis. Well, considering that this administration doesn't respect or abide by the U.S. Constitution to begin with, and they selectively choose to enforce what they want to, I wouldn't be surprised by this. And our whole debt issue is like a whole other problem that we're about to face. And for those of you who don't understand how significant this is, I read a great article that came out in the Washington Times yesterday, and it was talking about how the value of a dollar works and about how the government spending money that we don't have creates inflation, which obviously makes people poorer because our earnings are being transferred to the government. And this is being done to cover their 147% increase in borrowing. And so as the value of the dollar shrinks, it means our money buys less and we need to spend more on the same thing. And yes, this sounds like common sense, right? But what people may not realize is that when the government creates these trillions of dollars, all of this money is basically coming out of our paychecks and our bank accounts. Because the article used the example of like the average family's weekly paycheck right now is about $200 more than it was in January of 2021, but it buys about $100 less worth of stuff. And the government really doesn't have purchasing power on its own. All of it comes from borrowing money and taxing citizens. And this inflation is basically taxing us without our permission. And it's subtly confiscating like trillions and trillions of dollars from the American people while prices are rising faster than wages. And like, if you have savings, you're fucked because the value of your savings is also declining. And if there is no resolution on this whole debt ceiling thing, and if the Democrats cave and they allow Biden to raise the debt ceiling, this is going to get really fucking bad. Like the amount of damage that this administration has done to our country in just 2 short years is abominable. And it is honestly like unfathomable to me and totally insane. But I know I went off on a tangent, and let me just go back to Trump real quick, because I just want to point out that in this CNN town hall meeting, Collins was focused on the Jean Carroll case. And Stephanie, that was the former journalist who alleged that Trump sexually assaulted her in a department store back in the 1970s. And Collins introduced Trump by saying, quote, he's the first former president in more than a century to seek a return to the White House, and he's currently facing multiple criminal investigations and an indictment. Just yesterday, he was held liable for sexual abuse and defamation. Stephanie, can you imagine if a reporter or moderator introduced Biden this way during a press conference? Like, it wouldn't even be allowed.
No, they're not supposed to be biased. And here, that's the thing. They don't even care anymore because they get away with it. So they don't care. It's unreal.
Exactly. Yeah, just a couple days ago, like Biden lost his cool at a press conference about the debt ceiling because the reporter was asking him about negotiations with McCarthy, and he just kept interrupting her while she was trying to ask the question. And at one point he snaps at her and he's like, you don't listen either, so why should I even answer your question? And I'm going to guess that, let's say this same scenario happens in July under the new rules. This reporter would clearly receive a warning for being unprofessional and violating conduct expectations, which again, totally vague, or she would just be flat out banned from ever attending another press conference. So this is clear selection of freedom of speech, and that is fucking unconstitutional.
It's unconstitutional. And how is that any better than what they do in Ukraine or Russia or any of these other places? I mean, it's really scary when you look at how much has changed in 2.5 years. Like it's wild. And like I said before, while we still can, people got to start speaking up. We can't just keep going along as the silent majority. This is blatantly wrong. They're completely exposing themselves and the deep state. And why are we taking it? We need to stand up and start speaking out about it, because this should not be allowed. And no one should be tuning in to places like CNN if this is the kind of bullshit that they're going to pull.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm all revved up now, you guys. So I hope you are too, though. Like, pay attention to this. Like, our country this is not good. It's not okay. And you should stop just sitting around and letting it happen. Like, we've all got to be fired up and we got to speak out. I'm sick of it. Sick of it. And now I need to go have a drink because I'm all like riled up about this. So I hope that you guys have a great weekend and stand up for our freedoms while we still, have them. And yeah, we'll see you back here for our Motivation Manifestation Monday. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you get our latest episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you could, please rate and review the show. We are going to be reading every single review, and I would love it if you hopped over to Instagram at Unapologetically Outspoken and say hi. We want to see who's out there and start a conversation, plus get all of the topics that you want us to talk about next. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.